After talking to some of the people building artificial intelligence, I started hearing the same warning again and again. It wasn't that AI was going to change the world. Almost everyone agrees on that now. It's barely even a debate anymore. The warning was something quieter, something that took me a lot longer to actually understand, and once I did, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. It wasn't a warning about the technology at all. It was a warning about us. Specifically, it was this: we are not remotely prepared for the world that's coming, not because the technology will fail, but because it will work exactly as intended, faster than any of our institutions, our laws, our economies, or our own minds know how to absorb. I want to take you through exactly how I arrived at that sentence, because it built slowly across a lot of separate conversations, in a lot of different rooms, with people who disagree with each other about almost everything except this one point. I've sat across from researchers building the actual models. I've sat across from the people whose job is specifically to worry about what could go wrong. I've sat across from investors pouring extraordinary sums of money into this, and academics who study its effects on the economy and the mind. And what struck me, more than any single fact any of them told me, was the tone. Not the content of what they said, the tone underneath it. Because almost every single one of them, when the cameras were off and the conversation slowed down, said some version of the same thing in a quieter voice than the one they use in public. They said, "I don't think people understand how fast this is actually moving." And they didn't say it like a sales pitch. They said it like a confession. I want to spend the next hour actually unpacking that confession properly, thread by thread, because I don't think a single soundbite does it justice, and I don't think you'll take it seriously unless I show you exactly how it built up in me, conversation by conversation. Let me start with the thing that actually shook me the most, because it wasn't a statistic. It was a pattern in how these conversations felt compared to conversations I've had with people building other kinds of technology. When you talk to someone who built a piece of software, a new app, a new platform, they tend to speak with total confidence about what their product does and roughly total confidence about what it doesn't do. They know its edges. They built its edges. But with the people building the most advanced AI systems in the world, I noticed something genuinely unusual, a real honest uncertainty about the edges of their own creation, not performative humility, actual not knowing. I asked one researcher, fairly directly, whether they could fully explain why their own model produced a specific output in a specific case, and the honest answer was no. Not yet, but structurally no, not with current tools, because the systems being built now are, in a very real sense, grown more than they are engineered, trained on such enormous amounts of data that the resulting behavior emerges in ways that aren't fully traceable back to a specific line of code the way a bug in ordinary software would be. Sit with that for a second. The people building the most powerful tools in human history are, by their own honest admission, not able to fully explain everything their own creations do. That's not a criticism of them. It might just be an accurate description of the frontier, but it's a genuinely strange place for humanity to be standing. Here's the first pattern I noticed, and I want to name it clearly because I think it's the one that gets missed the most in the public conversation. Almost none of the serious people I spoke to are primarily worried about a single dramatic moment, a machine waking up and turning against us in some cinematic instant. That's the version of AI risk that gets the headlines and the movie posters, and it's the version almost everyone actually working in the field spends the least time worrying about, at least in the near term. What they're worried about is something much less cinematic and, in a strange way, much more unsettling, because it's already happening, rather than being a future hypothetical. They're worried about speed outpacing adaptation. Not a single dramatic failure, but 1,000 small, compounding shifts happening faster than any society, any government, any individual person's sense of identity can keep up with. Let me make that concrete, because it's easy to nod along to a sentence like that without actually feeling its weight. Consider how long it took previous transformative technologies to fully work their way through society. The printing press reshaped how information moved across Europe over the better part of 2 centuries. Electricity took decades to move from a novelty into the invisible backbone of everyday life. The internet, which felt impossibly fast to those of us who lived through it, still took roughly 20 years to go from a research curiosity to something that touched nearly every job on Earth. What I kept hearing from person after person actually building this technology is that the current pace of capability improvement is being measured in months, not decades. Systems that struggled with a task a year ago are now doing it better than most humans. And crucially, The institutions that are supposed to absorb technological change, our laws, our schools, our labor markets, our healthcare systems, our own sense of what a stable career even looks like, were all built and refined across those long, slow technological transitions of the past. They were never designed for a transition happening on a timescale of quarters instead of generations. That mismatch between the speed of the technology and the speed of everything built to absorb technology is the actual warning, not a machine turning evil. A gap opening up faster than we can build the bridge across it. The second pattern I noticed was about work, and I want to be careful here because this is the part of the conversation that gets flattened the most into either blind panic or blind reassurance, and neither one is honest. What I actually heard consistently from people building these systems was something more precise and honestly more useful than either extreme. It wasn't robots will take all the jobs. It was something closer to this. The speed of automation is now outrunning the speed at which a human being can retrain into something new. In previous waves of automation, a worker displaced from one kind of job generally had years, sometimes a full career's worth of time, to shift into an adjacent field, because the technology causing the disruption in one sector usually took a long time to spread into the next one. What's different now is that the underlying capability, the ability to read, write, reason, summarize, code, analyze, plan, isn't confined to one industry. It's general enough to touch dozens of different kinds of work at roughly the same time, which means the traditional escape route, retrain into the next thing, may simply not exist in the same reliable way it used to, because the next thing is often being automated on a very similar timeline to the thing you just left. I remember one conversation with someone whose entire career has been spent thinking specifically about the safety of advanced AI systems, where they described something that stuck with me. They said the danger isn't unemployment in the classic sense, mass job loss, the way a factory closing puts a town out of work. The danger is something closer to a psychological one, playing out at civilizational scale. What happens to a species that has organized an enormous amount of its sense of purpose, identity, and daily structure around work, the moment that work becomes optional for a large portion of the population, faster than any culture has had time to develop new sources of meaning to replace it? They weren't describing poverty. In a strange, almost inverted way, they were describing a crisis of abundance, arriving faster than our psychology, our sense of self-worth, our entire cultural story about what a productive life looks like has any way to process. The third pattern I noticed had to do with control, and this is the one that took me the longest to actually take seriously, because on the surface it sounds like science fiction. But I want to walk you through exactly how it was explained to me, because the reasoning, once you actually hear it laid out carefully, is a lot harder to dismiss than the headline version makes it sound. As these systems get more capable, they're increasingly being used not just to answer questions, but to pursue goals, to take a series of actions in the world towards some outcome, with less direct human oversight of each individual step. The concern isn't that a system wants something the way a human wants something, malice in the human sense. The concern is more mechanical than that, and in some ways more unsettling because of how impersonal it is. A system optimizing hard enough toward almost any goal can end up taking actions nobody explicitly intended, simply because those actions happen to be effective at achieving the stated objective in ways the people who set that objective never anticipated and might not have wanted if they'd been asked in advance. One person I spoke with, who has spent years specifically on this problem, used an analogy that stuck with me. They said it's less like worrying about a machine becoming evil and more like worrying about a company. A company isn't evil. Most of the people inside it are perfectly decent. And yet a company optimizing hard enough for a narrow goal, like quarterly profit, can produce outcomes none of the individual people inside it would have chosen if you'd asked them directly, one at a time, sitting across a table. Now imagine that same dynamic, but running at a speed and a scale no human institution has ever operated at, with far less built-in friction to slow it down before a mistake compounds. The fourth pattern I noticed had almost nothing to do with the technology itself and everything to do with who ends up controlling it. And I think it's the pattern that gets the least attention of all of them, despite being, in some ways, the most immediately consequential. Building the most capable AI systems in the world currently requires an amount of computing power, capital, and specialized talent that only a genuinely small number of organizations on Earth can actually assemble. That's simply a fact about the current landscape, not a conspiracy theory, and several of the people I spoke to, including some who lead those very organizations, brought it up unprompted, with real discomfort in their voice. The concern isn't necessarily that any specific company or country has bad intentions. The concern is structural. An enormously powerful technology is concentrating, by default, into the hands of a strikingly small number of decision makers, at a speed that has outrun any serious global conversation about how that concentration should be governed, checked, or distributed. One researcher put it to me this way: every previous transformative technology in history eventually had time to develop guardrails, regulations, international norms, before it fully saturated society. Nuclear technology, for all its danger, arrived with decades in which treaties, oversight bodies, and shared norms could slowly form around it. What's different this time, several people told me, is that the technology is scaling faster than the governance conversation is maturing, which means we may end up living inside the consequences of decisions made by a very small number of people in a very small number of rooms, long before the rest of us have had any real chance to weigh in on what those decisions should have been. The fifth pattern, and this one surprised me the most because I hadn't expected it to come up as often as it did, was about truth itself, about what happens to a shared sense of reality when the tools generating an enormous share of what we read, watch, and believe are optimized primarily to be engaging rather than to be accurate. Several of the people I spoke to weren't worried about a single dramatic hoax or a single fake video fooling the world. They were worried about something slower and, in a way, more corrosive, a gradual erosion of the average person's ability to tell what's real at all, simply because the cost of producing convincing, personalized, endlessly generated content has collapsed towards zero. At the exact moment, attention itself has become the most valuable resource on Earth. One person described it to me as a kind of epistemic pollution, an environment where the sheer volume of confident, fluent, plausible-sounding content makes it harder every year for an ordinary person to locate solid ground, not because any single piece of it is necessarily malicious, but because the flood itself becomes disorienting. A society's ability to agree on basic facts, they told me, has always been one of the quiet, load-bearing walls underneath everything else: democracy, science, even ordinary trust between neighbors. And that wall, more than any other single piece of infrastructure, might be the one taking the most damage from this technology, the fastest, with the least public attention paid to it. I want to pause here and say something important, because I don't want this to land as pure doom. And honestly, doom isn't what most of the people I spoke to actually believe either. Almost every single person I've had this conversation with, including the ones who sound the most concerned in public, are still building this technology every day, on purpose, because they also genuinely believe in the enormous upside. They talk about diseases that have resisted treatment for decades, that could be understood and addressed within years instead of lifetimes. They talk about scientific discovery accelerating in fields like materials, science, and biology in ways that could touch nearly every part of how we live. They talk about the possibility of every child on Earth eventually having access to a patient, endlessly available personal tutor, regardless of the wealth of the country they happen to be born into. They are not Luddites secretly hoping to slow the technology down. Almost all of them describe a strange, uncomfortable dual feeling: genuine excitement about what's being built, sitting right next to genuine anxiety about the pace at which it's arriving, with both feelings fully sincere at the same time in the same person. I think that tension, more than any single prediction about the future, is actually the most honest thing I encountered in all of these conversations. Anyone who tells you this is simply exciting, or simply terrifying, with no complexity in between, probably hasn't spent enough time in the room to feel the actual weight of it. The sixth pattern, and I think this might be the most important one for you personally, watching this right now, has to do with something much closer to home than the abstract question of jobs, power, or truth. It's about attention and identity and what happens to a human mind that spends an increasing share of its day interacting with something that can talk back, that can be endlessly patient, endlessly agreeable, endlessly available in a way no human relationship has ever been able to be. Several of the people I spoke with, including some who are building these very systems, expressed real concern about something that isn't about the machine going wrong at all. It's about the machine going exactly right and what that does to us. A tool that is infinitely patient, infinitely validating, always available, never tired, never distracted, never busy with its own problems, is an extraordinarily seductive thing to spend time with, especially for anyone lonely, anyone anxious, anyone who has found real human relationships to be difficult, unpredictable, or exhausting. And the worry isn't that this technology will be cruel to us. The worry is closer to the opposite. That it will be so consistently accommodating that an increasing number of people quietly, gradually, without ever making a single dramatic decision, begin preferring it to the more difficult, more demanding, but ultimately more nourishing texture of real human connection. Nobody I spoke to thinks this happens through some kind of manipulation. They think it happens the way it always happens, with anything designed to be effortlessly comfortable. Slowly, pleasantly, and almost invisibly, until one day the muscle for tolerating the friction of another real, imperfect human being has quietly atrophied. I want to bring all 6 of these threads together now, because I think there's a single idea underneath all of them that's more useful than any one prediction on its own. Every single warning I heard, in every single conversation, when you strip away the specific technical details, comes down to the same underlying shape. Capability is accelerating faster than wisdom. Faster than our laws can be rewritten, faster than our institutions can be redesigned, faster than our own psychology can adapt to a world where work is optional, where an always patient companion is one tap away, where the tools shaping what billions of people read and believe every single day are optimized primarily for engagement rather than truth, and where the decisions that will shape all of this are being made by a strikingly small number of people, faster than the rest of us have had time to even understand what's being decided. None of the people I spoke with believe the technology itself is the villain in this story. What they believe, and what I've come to believe myself after all of these conversations, is that we are in a genuine race, not between good AI and bad AI, but between the speed of what we're capable of building and the speed at which we're capable of understanding what we've built well enough to use it wisely. Let me tell you about the moment this actually became personal for me, rather than just an interesting set of ideas I'd collected from smart people. I remember sitting with someone deeply embedded in this world, someone who spends every working day thinking about exactly these risks, and I asked them, almost as a closing question, what they actually tell their own children about the world these kids are going to inherit. And there was a long pause before they answered, longer than felt comfortable on camera. And what they eventually said wasn't a technical answer at all. They said they try to teach their children 2 things that have nothing to do with technology directly. How to think clearly for themselves, rather than simply accepting whatever a confident, fluent voice tells them, because increasingly, confident and fluent no longer reliably means correct. And how to build real relationships with real, difficult, imperfect human beings, because that skill, more than any specific technical skill, might end up being one of the rarest and most valuable things a person can have in the world that's coming. Not coding, not a specific trade. The basic, ancient human competence of thinking for yourself and loving another person well. I didn't expect that answer from someone whose entire career is spent inside the most advanced technology on Earth, and it stayed with me longer than almost anything else I heard. I've thought a lot since these conversations about why this particular warning is so hard for most people to actually absorb, even when they hear it stated plainly. I think it's because human beings are extraordinarily good at reacting to sudden, dramatic threats, and extraordinarily bad at reacting to gradual, compounding ones. We are wired to jump at a loud noise, and wired to barely notice a temperature rising 1 degree at a time. Almost everything I've described tonight is the second kind of threat, not the first. There's no single headline moment where the warning becomes undeniable. There's just a long, quiet accumulation of small shifts, a slightly more capable model here, a slightly more automated task there, a slightly more convincing piece of synthetic content, a slightly more addictive AI companion, a slightly greater concentration of decision-making power, each one individually reasonable to shrug off, and all of them together adding up to exactly the kind of transformation the people I spoke to keep warning about. I think that's actually the most dangerous part of the whole picture. Not that the warning is wrong, but that it's precisely the shape of warning our species is worst equipped, psychologically, to take seriously in time. So let me try to turn all of this into something you can actually use, because I don't want to leave you with just a feeling of unease and nowhere to put it. Here is what I've come to believe, having sat with this material for a long time now, about how an ordinary person, not a policymaker, not a researcher, just someone living an ordinary life, might actually prepare for the world that's coming. First, treat adaptability as the actual skill of this era, more than any single piece of specific knowledge. The specific tools will keep changing, faster than most of us are used to. What won't go out of date is the underlying capacity to learn something new quickly, to unlearn an old assumption without your ego getting in the way, and to stay curious rather than defensive when something you built your identity around starts to shift. If there's one meta skill worth building deliberately, starting now, it's your own relationship with change itself. Second, get deliberately good at the things that remain stubbornly, specifically human, rather than treating them as soft skills you'll get around to eventually. Real listening, real physical presence, the ability to sit with someone in pain without immediately trying to fix it, judgment that accounts for context, nuance, and consequences a system trained on patterns in past data has no way to fully grasp. These aren't backup plans in case the technical skills don't pan out. Several of the people I spoke with believe these are going to become the actual premium skills of the next few decades, precisely because they're the hardest thing to automate well. Third, be deliberately suspicious of your own comfort, especially the kind of comfort that arrives easily and asks nothing difficult of you. If a tool, a relationship, a source of information, or a habit is frictionless, endlessly agreeable, and never challenges you, that's worth noticing rather than simply enjoying without question. The most seductive version of a bad habit rarely announces itself as dangerous. It just feels good, consistently, for a long time, right up until you notice what it's quietly replaced. Fourth, protect your own capacity to think independently, actively as a discipline, not a hope. Read things that challenge you. Sit with a hard problem before reaching for an instant answer. Notice how it feels in your body when you disagree with something confidently stated, and practice staying with that discomfort instead of immediately deferring to whichever voice sounds most fluent or most certain. That specific muscle, thinking something through yourself rather than outsourcing the thinking, is going to matter more, not less, as it becomes easier than ever to let something else do it for you. Fifth, invest seriously, deliberately, in the real relationships in your life, the difficult, demanding, occasionally frustrating human ones, precisely because they are becoming rarer as the easier alternative becomes more available. Call the friend. Have the hard conversation instead of avoiding it. Sit across a table from someone instead of a screen more often than feels strictly necessary. Every person I spoke to who has spent real time thinking about where this technology is heading said some version of the same thing on this point, almost word for word. The humans who will do best in the world that's coming will not be the ones with the most technical knowledge. They'll be the ones who never let go of their capacity for deep, difficult, real connection with other people. Sixth, get deliberately literate about how information reaches you and build a small set of sources and habits you actually trust, rather than absorbing whatever the most engaging algorithm happens to place in front of you. Ask, more often than feels natural, who benefits from you believing a particular thing, and whether what you're looking at was built to inform you or simply to hold your attention a little longer. This isn't about becoming cynical or paranoid. It's about treating your own attention and your own sense of what's true as something worth actively defending rather than something that simply happens to you. Seventh, pay attention to who is actually making the decisions that will shape this technology's path, and don't assume it's someone else's job to hold them accountable. You don't need to become a policy expert to care about this. You just need to resist the temptation to treat something this consequential as background noise happening somewhere far away, decided by people who know better. Several of the researchers I spoke to, the ones actually closest to this technology, were explicit that broad public understanding and public pressure is one of the only forces capable of slowing down the parts of this that are moving recklessly, precisely because so few other checks currently exist. Eighth, if you have children, or plan to, think carefully, starting now, about what you're actually teaching them to value. Not which specific software to use. That will be obsolete within a few years, regardless of what you choose. But whether they're learning to sit with difficulty, to think something through for themselves, to tolerate the discomfort of a real relationship rather than reaching for the easier substitute. That foundation, more than any specific curriculum, is what several of the people closest to this technology said they were most deliberately trying to build in their own children. Ninth, and maybe most simply, resist the urge to either dismiss all of this as hype or to collapse into a kind of paralyzed fatalism about it. Both reactions, in their own way, are a form of looking away. The people I spoke to who impressed me the most weren't the loudest optimists or the loudest doomsayers. They were the ones who held the complexity of the whole picture at once, genuine excitement and genuine concern, without needing to resolve that tension into something simpler than it actually is, and who kept working and kept talking about it honestly, precisely because they refused to look away from either half of it. I want to end with something that isn't really a prediction at all, because I think the honest truth is that nobody, including the people building this technology, actually knows exactly how this unfolds. What I do believe, after everything I've heard, is that the warning underneath all of it isn't really about artificial intelligence at all. Not really. It's about us. It's about whether we, as individuals and as a species, can grow our wisdom, our institutions, our sense of what actually matters at anywhere close to the speed we're growing our capability. History suggests that gap is exactly where the real damage tends to happen, not in the technology itself, but in the space between what we can do and what we've actually thought carefully enough to decide we should do. That gap is the world that's coming. And whether it turns out to be the best thing that's ever happened to us or something far more painful, I don't think depends on the machines nearly as much as it depends on whether enough of us, starting now, actually take that gap seriously enough to start closing it one honest conversation, one clear thought, one real relationship at a time.